Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Once again, welcome to our fourth webinar on business process management. We are at the last journey in this series to achieve our first milestone on to understand business process management. In our first webinar, we started with the basic concepts of business process management, where we primarily focused on what and why. And then it is followed to the next level where we discuss what are the essential building blocks for an organization when they start thinking about a business process management journey. We discussed about the Tregear circle, and we discussed in detail that the circles should keep on turning. We continued the journey in our third webinar, the last webinar that we conducted last Friday, on business process architecture. In the architecture, we discussed about the hierarchy of the business processes and how these business processes should be linked with the strategies, with the business objectives. And so we are continuing our journey. Today we are, as per a plan, we are on the episode 4th, and we are moving ahead towards our milestone 1, from confusion to clarity. So today we are going to discuss about, once an architecture is defined, how can we enable a process-based management in an organization? That means, how do we execute that BPM journey? And in this journey, one of the enabler we discussed, business process architecture. The other 6 enablers are all important. Here in this webinar, we are discussing 2 of the enablers, which is governance and measurement, process governance and process measurements, which are 2 important enablers to keep the circle turning. And that's what we are calling it as an active process management. For this webinar, once again, I welcome Mr. Roger Tregear for our session, our webinar on active process management for process governance and process measurement. Roger, with more than 20 years of exclusive experience in business, he's a speaker, advisor, always smiles like this. So it's such a pleasure to have Roger in the session as a speaker for us. Roger, welcome to you. Roger, we welcome you for our today's webinar. And I do not want to take much time. I would like to take you to hand over, and please start the session.
Thank you, Amit. Hello to everybody around the world listening live or listening to the recording. So, as Amit was just explaining, I want to talk about what I call active process management. This is the bit that happens after you've put the process architecture together, after we've had that first flush of excitement. Everyone's pretty keen on the new process architecture, and you started perhaps to focus on a couple of processes, get some KPIs. But you know, that's really when it needs to happen and keep happening, because this is process management. The rest of it was just an establishment project, and the rest of it is, what is it we're going to do forever? How are we going to actually manage these processes? So as we've covered before, and just to remind us, the circles give us a metamodel for management generally, but particularly for process management and process improvement. And you know, we've got 2 circles, so the PO circle, if you like, that's about process management. We're going to set targets, we're going to assess performance and deal with new ideas, and I'm going to respond to that, either by doing nothing because there's nothing to do, or we've had some signal that there's a problem, or we've had some new idea that needs to be tested, or we need to review the KPIs and targets, as we have to do from time to time. If we do need to investigate the process, that's going to trigger the PI circle, and that's a standard process improvement.
Roger, I'm sorry to interrupt. I'm hearing a message from few of the participants. They are not able to hear you. I hope just with 1 or 2, I hope you are able to hear. Okay.
I can hear you okay.
Yeah, all right, perfect. All right, Roger, all right, thank you so much. Roger, you can please continue. So sorry to interrupt you.
Let me try. Can you hear me now?
Yes. Thank you, Roger.
Better?
Yeah, please.
I think there might have been a problem here with a microphone. So the circles are giving us this ability to do continuous process management and continuous process improvement. So all the time looking for where is the best place to initiate some process analysis and process improvement work. And these are the circles that we want to turn. We want them to turn forever. And that's another way of thinking about active process management. I'll just check in with you, Ahmed. I see we've got lots of chats there. Can people hear me?
Yes, Roger.
Everything's okay?
Yeah, everything is fine.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so let's take a step back and look at this similar thing, but in a perhaps a slightly different way. We start the exercise, as you know from our conversations last time we were together, with strategy. And we say, what are the promises that we're making in the strategy? What are the strategy? What are the promises? And from that, we can derive the architecture. That's a relatively simple, straightforward exercise. Takes 3 or 4, maybe 5 weeks, depending on the state of the strategy. Now, we were dealing at that point with all of the processes. Now we can start looking at individual processes. So we'll pick some. You know, we're not going to try and manage hundreds of processes, but we'll pick. Let's say we pick 5. You might prefer 3 or 4. You could do it with 1, but I think you can do better than 1. So let's say we've got a handful of processes, and now we want to know, you know, what is it the stakeholders want from them? How could we track that? So what are the process KPIs? What targets should we set for those KPIs? So now we've defined a performance environment, and now we want to go on and manage that performance. So now we've come over this boundary here, and we've set up the definition of performance. Now let's go and see how well we're doing, and then what is it we've got to do to make a change. So is there a performance gap? Do we care? What's the impact of the gap? And if there is a gap we care about, what is it that we're going to do about it? So then we can see here that it's those two, the middle and the bottom piece that I think of as active process management. It's all of the work we do. That involves all of the enablers, of course, and the circles, but it's all of the work we do after we've defined our process architecture. It's how we go on to use the process architecture. And we're not doing it for hundreds or thousands of processes, but we're just going to start out. You could start with 1 if you wanted to. I think we can do better than 1, but you start with that and we move on from there. Just incrementally building our capability and building the number of processes we've got under active management. Okay, so that's the sort of thing we're trying to do. And of course, the process of process management is a process. So you can see up here, if you remember some of the architectures we looked at last time we were together, we've got lead or shared management processes up there at the top. Now, one of those processes, this guy right here, is called in this architecture, improved process performance. And that's a set of processes that we use to manage processes. So you can see that here's the expansion of it here. You can see one of the lower level processes. The next level is about maintaining a framework. And then here we're going to look after process management. Then we're going to be looking at process improvement. We've got whatever our process improvement method is, that's a process model. So that's the one down there. And then, of course, there's a lot of documentation going on, process modeling in the main, but whatever sort of documentation we're doing. So important to keep in mind that when we're talking about process management, then that must be a well-defined and well-executed and well-managed processes. I mean, on this slide, there's a set of KPIs there. We don't have to go into the details of those, but it's there to remind us that process management applies to every process. And we might argue that it applies to this one more than any other one, because if we can't manage this process well, then can we manage any others? Okay, so now I want to just go through we've only got a short time together today, so I can't go through entire body of knowledge on all of these issues, but I want to touch on some important pieces, and then we'll have time for some questions in the rest of the webinar and beyond. Now, clearly, what we're saying about process-based management is that it's about correcting the horizontal vision piece of the organisation. The organisation chart tells us all about how we manage up and down, but nothing about how we manage across. And that's the missing piece. So we've got to add that piece. It's a light management add-on. And I think of it in general terms like this kind of three-part model, where we've got a process council, a high-level executive committee of the organisation that can make executive decisions and take the overall view, solve any problems that might be needed. We've got the Office of BPM, or the Centre of Excellence, whatever you want to call it, the small group whose job it is to raise the capability of the rest of the organisation. They're not there to do everything, but just to support and do some compliance management, but mainly they're there to support. And then the key people we've got really are down here, the process owners. Again, you might prefer a different term to that, but that's a generic term that's commonly used. But this is a role, a part-time role that we assign to a process. This is the person who's going to think about the cross-functional operation of the process, and who's going to liaise with the functional managers who are executing the various pieces of the process. So it's a facilitation role. Think of it more as an auditor of the process, perhaps. So we need this governance model, and I think we certainly need support, we need ownership, and we need authority. and so this is my generic view of that. There might be other ways of doing it, but I think you still need those attributes of ownership, support, and authority. And keep in mind that this is a very different way of thinking about the organisation. So we're asking people to think differently about the organisation and how they manage it. Okay, so now let's just look at some other particular artifacts, just a few of these, and we'll touch on them one by one. Just waiting for your screen to pop up. There it is. Okay, so an important thing, it might seem like a trivial kind of thing, but it's the first one up there in the top left. We'll get a bigger picture in a moment. It's about a process description. And I think it's really important to get a well-described, well-shaped description of the process, just a word picture. Now, I'm not saying we do this for hundreds of processes. The more you do it, the easier it is to do it anyway. When we're putting an architecture together, we will capture a sentence about the process just to remind us what it was, because we've got so many. But when we come to do an active management of the process, we want a very specific process description. Now, it's not specific about the format or in which order things have got to be, but what we want to be sure of is we capture the who, the what, the why, the where, and the when. And you can see the example there. It's a classic process, a sub-process there, evaluate proposals. You can see it's a sub-process of decide funded projects. Came out of an actual project I did many years ago now for a government department. And it tells us generally, anyway, who's doing the work, what the work is, where we're doing it, why it's happening, to prioritize the funding. You can see it's color-coded there, and something about the timing. So I don't want to get too prescriptive about that, but what you don't want is a process description that says the evaluate proposal process evaluates proposals. That's absolutely accurate and totally useless. Right? So we want to have something that actually tells not just someone who knows all about it, but someone who's never seen it before, gives them a much better idea of what that's about. So a process description for a process under active management is an important thing for us to do. So let's come back. Now, the other thing that is a very useful thing, I think it's the best process model, process tool that exists. The one that's there in the middle called the process context diagram. Now, if you've done BP Trends training, then you know this as the scope diagram. If you've worked with Roger Belton, you might know it as the IGO diagram. I call it the context diagram because the big box here, right around the outside, everything inside that box is to do with the process. Everything outside is not to do with the process. So it gives us the context of the process. How does this process exist in its world? So we'll see here we've got inputs, outputs, guides, enablers, which is why it's called an IGOE in its very original form. Now, some of you are looking at that and you're saying, this is kind of like a SIPOC diagram, and you're right, it is. Or if you're being even more correct, a COPUS diagram, because we do have inputs and outputs. Outputs obvious, I think, inputs obvious. Guides are the things that tell us, that guide the transformation of inputs into outputs. Enablers are the systems, facilities, and people that enable the transformation of inputs into outputs. Now, we don't have a lot of time today to go through all the detail of this. There's an animated version of this slide. I'm happy to provide that for you if you like, or if you really want to have a detailed run through of it, I'm happy to do that sometime too in a separate session. But we identify the outputs. I mean, this is a process called make coffee. So, you know, we name the process in the middle and its sub-processes. An obvious output is coffee, and we want to know where that goes to, and it goes to the customer, if you like. That's not the only output though. I mean, we've got these other things: dirty utensils, usage data, waste. Now have a look out here. Waste, for example, goes out to this over here. Now the convention is that that's a box with rounded corners, so it's a process. It's another one of our processes. So waste goes off and is dealt with as an input to our process called reuse waste. So we start now to see that you could have a concatenation of context diagrams, and we start to see how this process relates to other processes. We've got some usage data here, which goes off to a process called procure supplies. Okay, so outputs. What are the inputs? Well, obviously there's a request, that's important. And then generally here, I've just made it pretty simple in this diagram. So we've got ingredients of all sorts coming. Oh, look, here they're coming from a process called procure supplies. Same one as we had over here and over here. So we've got our process providing inputs and taking outputs from this process. Energy is coming from a power utility, water, etc. So they're the inputs and the outputs, and then we've got people and systems and facilities that are providing they're enabling the transformation of inputs into outputs, and guides. Here they're pretty simple examples, recipes and machine manuals, but you know, in our real worlds they'd be things like strategy, guidelines, maybe legislation. If this was making coffee in a coffee shop, it'd be a price list. List of products available, those kinds of information-based artifacts that help us to make the transition from inputs into outputs. Now, once you've got that put together in the basic thing, you can see those red dots around there. What you can do is to start saying, where are the problems? You could put green dots and say, where are the opportunities? And then you can start prioritizing and saying, okay, what is it we've got to measure? So we've got a problem with waste. Okay, well, we're going to have to start measuring something about that waste. Now, what is that going to be? We need a KPI around waste, and we need to know how to get the data, etc., etc. And if we've got a problem up here, our customer doesn't like it. Okay, well, that's a big problem. Now, it might be if we've also got a problem over here with ingredients that we keep running out, or we buy them once a year and they're stale, or we've got a problem down here with our coffee machine. These might all be related. You know, it might be that the fact that we've got a problem with ingredients and a problem with the machine is what's causing the problem with the customer satisfaction. So we can look at this and have conversations without getting into technical model diagrams, etc. And have a nice conversation with all sorts of stakeholders And that kind of picture goes down well with any stakeholders. And I use it a lot myself. If I was sitting down talking to you and you're explaining a process to me that I didn't know about, I'd be drawing this diagram. I just find it such a rich diagram and such a useful thing to do. We need to move on, but if you need to know more about that, just contact me somehow, and happy to continue that, that conversation. Okay, so what other things do we need to do? Well, one of the most important things we need to identify about our process is, of course, about our stakeholders. Now, everybody understands that, and we all know that we want to do good stakeholder analysis, and it's a given, and it's obvious, and it's stakeholder management 101, but sometimes we don't do it as well as we should do. So this is the way I do it, a process stakeholder matrix, I call it, to give it a fancy name. And all we're doing here, so we're talking here about this particular process, recruit employee, this one up here. It just goes from here to here. So that's the process we're talking about. Now, who are the stakeholders? Now, stakeholders for me are people or groups of people, and I define them, I work out who they are by saying, who is it that gets something from the process and or gives something to the process? May not be balanced, they might just do one or the other, but not both. So if you do either of those, then you're a stakeholder. Now, you can obviously end up with a big long list of stakeholders, and it gets a bit silly. You know, if you had some concern about environment, you might say the people of the earth are a stakeholder. Well, sure, of course they are, but you'll get to a point when you go through a list and you'll run out of people or groups that you would reasonably go and talk to ask. So you end up with a list like this: the hiring manager, HR department, the candidates themselves, of course. We need to think about the external stakeholders, referees, perhaps even more external. Other departments in our organisation, so you know, IT, finance, facilities, whatever. We might have some sort of evaluation panel and some external agencies who might be doing some work for us in relation to recruitment. So we can go through each of those and we can say, preferably by talking to them, not by guessing, what's a hiring manager get from, what do they give to, and what is their objective? What's their big picture objective for this process? So we can do that for each of them, and then we end up with this set of stakeholder objectives. Now, one of the things that can happen, in fact happens often, is that you get conflicting objectives in there. Sometimes they're diametrically opposed. Someone wants something to go faster and someone wants it to go slower. So you have to reconcile that, because you can't carry that through to the KPIs. So I add this extra step there in that last column where we're going to do a synthesis of all of the objectives. Now, we've got to do this in conjunction with those stakeholders, of all of the stakeholders, and work out what we think would be good. We're not really trying to define KPIs just yet, but good general objectives. And we might decide here that we'd like to have have the first, we offer the first, every first offer we make gets accepted. So we pick the person we'd want best, and we offer them a job and they take it. Our third choice, which isn't a good idea. Nobody wants unnecessary delays or cost, unnecessary delay or cost. That's a bit vague. We need to sharpen that up later in KPI time. And then we need to know something about, you know, is it a fair process? Is it transparent? Are people happy? And maybe the people to ask about that are the candidates. You know, does a candidate have a valid complaint? I mean, all but one of them might be unhappy, of course, but do they actually have a valid complaint about the process? Was it good for them? Did we respect them? Was it timely, etc.? So, you know, we need to go through this step again, not for every process, but just for those ones that we want to put under active management, because we want to have a really sound basis for ultimately going on and deciding what our KPIs might be. So I won't go through the KPI piece, but we need to turn those into KPIs, set targets, and do that in a particularly useful way. And then I really can't go through the detail of it today, but I want to introduce you to it. And perhaps you know about it already, but I want to tell you about process behavior charts. or they're also called XMR charts. The basis of this, the main basis is a book. Well, it comes from Shewett and Deming all the way through, but Donald Wheeler's book, Understanding Variation, is the main reference book. A more recent one that I've only just recently read is Measures of Success by Mark Grabham, which is also a very good book. Both of those very readable and very much applies to the management of processes and improving them. So what we've got just basically here in this process behavior chart, and it's the same thing as an XMR chart. They originally called XMR charts, even by Wheeler. In the second edition of this book, Understanding Variation, Wheeler changed the name to process behavior chart because it's a more meaningful a chart with a less sense of following and looking for signals rather than trying to control the process. So what we've got here, we've got the data being plotted. We plot that as we go. The central line there, if you like, is an average performance level. And then we've got these limits here, natural process limits, upper and lower, and they're calculated. These are not targets, they're calculated. So we calculate that and we draw them based on a baseline set of data. Now what this is telling us is that with a very high level of confidence on a stable, predictable process, all of our data points will fall within the middle of those two limits. A high percentage, 99% of our data will fall through that if we've got a stable, predictable process. And then there are some rules we can use to test whether it's stable and predictable. And if all we've got is variation, as we're seeing here, then that's just routine variation. And we shouldn't bother about the fact that last month we were down here and next month we went up here and then 2 months later we were down here, and we don't want to chase that because it's just noise. Now, if, for example, though, this went up here before it came back down, then now we know we've got a now we know we've got a signal in the noise. There's some exceptional event has occurred. There's a change in the process, and we go off and chase it. So the whole point of a process behavior chart is to track the process, track the performance, and look for signals in the noise. React to the signals. We might want to investigate the noise because we might want to move this central line so the general performance is improved. But that's a very different thing to tracking all of these little variations which are going to happen anyway, just a routine variation. So I think that process behavior chart, easy enough to do. They're very simple. It's not high statistics. There's only two things you need to be able to calculate. It's an average and a moving range, and it's average. And we can all do that. And the calculation of those process limits is a very straightforward bit of arithmetic with a bit of multiplication and addition and subtraction. Easy to do, very powerful diagram for tracking data, and I think we should all be doing a lot more of that. So we do need, of course, to be able to discover KPIs, and we might want to do a bit of that process behavior chart tracking before we start trying to decide what the KPIs are, so that we can actually do it based on some knowledge rather than guesswork. I won't go through this in huge detail. I just want to make 3 points. Firstly, as I say up here, we should be inoculating ourselves against KPI disease. I've mentioned this before. There is no prize for having the most number of KPIs. We're talking about a small number of processes and a small number of KPIs, the critical few, the vital few, not the important many. What are the 2 or 3 things maybe that we could use to measure the process? So we need then, for each process, we're going to say, what are the process KPIs? Well, you can start out with a long list. You can go and have a look. The stakeholder matrix, of course, gave us some clues. You can look at it, you can see where the process performance problems are. There might be regulatory things that you really must get hold of. You could go to all sorts of reference models and libraries of KPIs. You can talk to all sorts of stakeholders. You can find out what the KPIs might be. But ultimately, of course, you've got to do this here, and you've got to come up to the shortest list you can get away with. Get rid of redundancies. You know, is this an important thing we're measuring? Really important? We're measuring something that relates to the particular process. Can we actually collect the data? Those kinds of tests to say, have we got valid KPIs here? And of course, the best way of really knowing whether you've got valid KPIs is always going to be using them. And if they turn out not to be as good as you thought, change them. That's the whole point of continuous management. The PO circle allows us to do that whenever we want to. Just in passing, I'll mention down there in the bottom right-hand corner, there's a 2-day training course. Has been one of my projects for the lockdown period. That's pretty much in place now, and we just need to find ways of delivering that in this new world. So lots more material there, and I really wanted to put all that stuff together because I think I see too often we get the process architecture. That's great. We start doing a couple of processes, but it's not sustained. You know, and we really need to do it. It's not hard to do. We just need to keep it as simple as possible and make it as likely as we can that we can actually do it. So, so just to finish off, so we can get on to your questions. So what are we trying to do here? So we've done the process architecture. That's a kind of, it's not fixed, of course, but it's a stable platform on which we're going to work. And now what we're doing, we want to start measuring and managing those processes. We want to get these circles actively turning. And the point of doing that, of course, is so that we can make change, which is to say, improve the process, fix or preempt problems, pick up new ideas, generally increase the level of the process performance. So measurement, governance, and change, architecture, measurement, governance are the sort of infrastructure, the hardware, if you like. Change is the purpose. And we still need to have the process culture and capability and support going on to be able to do all of those other things. So we're not pushing them to the side. They're all inextricably woven in with what we're trying to do. So active process management is the physical things. What are the practical things we can do to actually make this work? And the question I'd like to leave you with, you can take it on board and answer it later. What if this? What if the most effective and efficient process in your organization was that process we saw way back there in the management processes of improved process performance, the process of process management and improvement? What if the thing your organization was best at was doing that? The effect of that would be profound, wouldn't it? Is it possible? Of course it is. I've just gone through the highlights of how we do it. I think it is possible, and I think we should be trying. So I'll hand back to Amit. I see we've got a bunch of questions here that we'll answer now or later if we don't get them all done. But Amit will guide us through that, and I'll do my best to answer them. Over to you, Amit.
Thank you, Roger. Such an informative session. Got a very good clarity about process governance and measurement, and good concept about scope diagram. Heard a lot about it. We have used it also, scope diagram, and you rightly said it is a part of this. It is also known as a SIPOC. Part of it is covered in the SIPOC as well, or COPIS, like it is said. So really a good session. I have got a few questions which I will, I'll take it with you. All right, so the very first question that we got is about who is the right person to be the process custodian? Can this work if the role is closely aligned to the organizational structure? I think this is a question we heard of many times about the process governance. Yeah, please.
And it's a really important question. And process custodian,
true.
by the way, is probably my favorite term for process owner. I use process owner in the diagrams because it's a common term, but custodian is nice. So when you're first starting, I think the best people to appoint as process custodians or owners are the people who are really keen to have that role. This is when we're first starting, you know, your first 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 process owners. You really need to pick people who are keen to do it. And there will be such people for sure. Now, in theory, if we take it, we're down the track a bit, in theory for any process, anyone could be the process owner. Because it's not a matter of being the subject matter expert. It's about, you know, taking that horizontal view, the cross-functional view. Inevitably, though, it helps if you've got some subject matter expertise. So often case, it would be one of the managers who are managing, the functional managers who are managing pieces of the process. Because if it's cross-functional, of course, there is probably not one manager. So it's not that, but it's probably one of those people or someone who's got some subject matter expertise and some skin in the game. I wouldn't inextricably link it to a box on the organisation chart. However, it does make sense to have a process owner. Imagine they've got to call a meeting of the people who manage the parts of the process execution. Now imagine that they've got to go up 3 levels in the organisation and across 2 divisions to call a meeting. Not going to happen, is it? So really, when I think about that meeting of the people who can change the process collectively, and that's facilitated by the process owner, I think it's going to help a lot if that's a meeting of peers or near peers. So they're at a similar level in the organisation. Otherwise, you're just going to have too many difficulties. So I think they're the main answers to that. But, you know, perhaps the person you don't want as a process owner is someone who doesn't want to be a process owner, for sure. Thanks, Emmett.
Yeah, sure. Probably, Roger, this question comes up many times because the ownership we define as part of the organization structure because of the authority purpose that the particular process is defined to a particular level of the people in the organization. So this is the reason
So I'm not sure
guess
that I
one of
got
the
that.
reasons
Just
that
try it again.
most of the I'm saying most of the time when this question has been asked, we have seen in the organization the ownership of a process is defined as per the organization structure, the person who's senior most in the structure, so that the person is having an authority, so that person can take the right decision, can do something in terms of the change management.
Sure.
So
yeah. So,
right.
but you address that issue as well if you do what I said about having a meeting of peers, because that means that for a high-level process,
yes,
you know, care for patients in the hospital from last week, in that particular case, the process owner was the chief of medicine. So if you've got a very high-level process and the group of people who can meet, who have the authority to make changes to that process at that level, then they are senior people. They're at the high level, they're C-level executives. As you work your way down, of course, then you don't want C-level executives making actively trying to get involved in a level 4 process discussion. And they don't want to be there either. It's not strategic anymore. And if you have a problem at that level, then you've got the process council. If you remember the tripartite model, we can go back to the council if we need something to be resolved. What's next, Emmett?
Okay. Roger, this question is about this. Yeah. Hello. Hello.
Yeah, I can hear you now, I think.
Hello. Yeah.
Breaking
All
up.
right. Okay. Yeah. Roger, the second question is about the silos of the process systems in the organization. So one question which has been asked about, how can we make use of architecture to integrate, support, enabling service process into overall picture for the organization, so that silos do not form with things like IT processes? How do we make the connections and relationships into the core business processes clear and transparent to everyone?
Okay,
I think this is, yeah. Yes.
Yeah, so not every process is core, of course. Core processes are the ones that are directly delivering on the strategic value propositions, and things like IT and finance and you know, HR, etc. Perfectly reasonable support processes. Doesn't mean they're not important, of course. We don't have unimportant processes, but they are support processes. And in the support process world, it is likely that it'll be pretty obvious who's executing most of the process. But if you take recruitment, go back to that recruit staff process we were talking about briefly, you know, it's not just the HR department that's executing that, is it? We had a hiring manager, we've got finance, we've got IT, we've got facilities, we've got external agencies, and we have the HR people. So it's genuinely cross-functional. So the process called recruit staff is a cross-functional process. It's not just something that HR does. And when HR tries to do it themselves, it doesn't work, and HR, you know, almost never wants to do it themselves anyway. They can't. They're a service organisation. So it's not a matter of pulling those support processes into the core, but it's a matter of understanding how those support processes impact the core and which processes they're directly related to. And once you've got a nice architecture and you've got some detail in it, and you've got a good modelling tool, then you can start linking those things, of course. And of course, even at those lower levels, something like IT, you might say, well, COBIT or ITIL is our model of how we deliver IT services. You might just pick those up, you might modify them a bit. So there's a lot of detail down there. It's always true that the lower we get down through process architecture, the narrower the cross-functional element, and at some point we'll get to a process that is not cross-functional. The process will map on to someone's job or some team's job. So it's not a matter of, I mean, I think, you know, we just always need to be reminding people that there are two dimensions here. We do have an organisation chart. We are going to manage up and down that chart, but we also need to have this add-on to pick up the cross-functional management that's missing, and that's the process architecture. So we'll have those two artifacts, an org chart and the process architecture. And it's processes everywhere that's actually delivering the value that we're in business to deliver. So I think that answers. If it doesn't, I'm happy to follow that up later.
Yeah, okay. Roger, a question is regarding the method to quantify KPIs. So the person would like to know, is there any mathematical model around, or it is based on guesswork or gut feelings?
So there's two things we do for KPI, of course. We firstly decide what the KPI is, and then we need to set targets. And defining the KPI, at least as I'm doing it, a KPI itself would not have any, wouldn't be quantified. So if you think back now to that, again, to recruit staff that we were talking about, so we would say maybe that the KPI is the percentage of first offers accepted. All right, so all our stakeholders, we spoke about that. That's a really powerful KPI, by the way, because we want to make offers, we want to pick the best people and have them come and work for us. That's the point of recruitment, right? So we don't want to be taking second and third choice. So we want to be able to do that. So that's the KPI. Now, we've got to say now, what is our target? Is it 90%? 95%? If it's 100%, we need to think about that very carefully, because that's an error-proof process we've got to build. And maybe it's 99 or 99.9, or maybe we're going to have a different number depending on the level of the person in the hierarchy of the organisation, or where they fit in some parts. Some places we just really need to get the best. And in other places, maybe it's not so important. So we need to think about that. So we've got a KPI, and we might have one number. It might be, you know, we need 95% of first offers to be accepted over the period of 12 months. Or we might end up with more of a matrix or even an n-dimensional space that's defining the numbers that we put in there against that. Now, we might also, though, want to have a look at a process behaviour chart for a while and just see how the process is performing. Because if at the moment 80% of first offers are being accepted, and it's fairly stable and predictable at that level, then setting the target for 99 doesn't change the performance. And, you know, that's a big jump. So we need to think about that. So we might want to say, well, if it's at this level now, our target for now is to take it to this level and then this, and then we might want to go up. So making up targets is never a good idea. Making up a target because someone read it in the Harvard Business Review is a really bad idea. There may be some competitive reasons for selecting a particular target, and maybe that's okay. And maybe some targets just tell them, they announce themselves. We've got a process taking children home on a bus from school. Is 99.99% okay? You know, we only lost one child for the whole year. Yeah, maybe not. So maybe our target is 100%. But if it is, then we've got to do something serious about the process. So 2 steps. What is the KPI? And then how are we going to quantify that KPI? We certainly need to quantify it, but it may not just be one number. And that's the thing that's likely to change over time. As the process gets better and better, we're always going to test to say, is there a business case for raising it? It used to be 95%. Is there a business case for making it 98? There's probably a cost. Is there a benefit? Yeah, that kind of thing. Yep, so what do we got next?
Roger, I am combining 2 questions because these are related. The first question is talking about who owns PO-PI circle in an organization. And the second question is about
what?
PO and PI circle, the Tregear circle.
Okay.
And who is responsible for process improvement in an organization? Who is accountable for that?
Okay, so this depends how you define the role of process owner. I like to define a process owner role, and remember it's a role, not a full-time job, a part-time role. I like to clear up the whole thing about authority by saying they've got no authority. Their job is to be continually looking at the process and its performance and its potential, and putting the hand up and saying, hey, we've got a problem, or hey, I've got an idea, and bringing that to the group of people who do execute the process. It's the people who execute the process that are going to make the changes. They own the structural piece of the organization. You know, that's the director of HR owns all of those pieces, for example. So I don't think you should say that the process owner is responsible for the performance of the process, because if you do, now you've got a conflict between functional managers and process owners, and it just, you know, it's hard to resolve. So everybody is responsible for the performance of the process. When we've got a problem, say, with a process, we'll do some analysis and we'll discover where the problem is, where the fix has got to be applied, and whoever owns that piece of the business is going to, you know, run that project, however projects normally get run. So it's the process owner whose job it is to run the circles, to facilitate the circles turning, supported by the Office of BPM, Process Excellence Group, whatever they're called. They're the 2 operational pieces, along with all the functional managers, of course. And then if something's not working, if we need someone to resolve a problem that seems irresolvable, that's what the process council is there for in part. We kick it upstairs and we get an executive decision about some conflict that we can't resolve at the lower level. So it's a little more complicated. It's not a matter of saying the process owner is the person who will blame if the process isn't working properly. It's not a blame game. We want to manage collaboratively in the same way as our processes work collaboratively. Did that get it?
Okay.
What else, Emmett?
Yeah. Roger, if I continue with a similar question for the process ownership. Yes, Roger, am I audible?
Yes, got you, yep.
I hope I'm audible, Roger.
Yes.
All right. Roger, one question is in continuation of this one. For a process owner, what do you suggest would be more useful? Is it a capability with influencing skill, or someone having a subject matter expertise? I think
so. Sorry, what were the 2 things? Subject matter expertise, or what? What was the first one? You broke up.
Influencing skill.
Oh, okay. Well, yeah. If I had to choose between the 2, it would be the people skills, the facilitation skills. There's plenty of expertise around. The processes are full of subject matter expertise. You've got plenty of those. So if you could only have one, then I'd pick someone who had those skills that could bring a team together and actively look for problems and be delighted when they found one. You know, that's what we say for continuous improvement. What we're doing is continuous problem finding, and we're not so comfortable with that usually. So we need someone who can facilitate that kind of operation. So yeah, if I've got to pick one, I'd prefer not to have to pick one, of course. And if you've got no one with facilitation skills, then you start with the subject matter expertise and you start working on their people skills, I guess. Or maybe you can get someone to come and, you know, help out for a while or something. But you need both. And you know, the whole point of starting with maybe just a handful of processes, or 2 or 3 if you like, is to test this out and to learn how to do it, and then to be able to demonstrate to others how you do it. That's why I say we just start with, you know, we pick a handful of processes. As soon as you put an architecture together, you've got 200, maybe 300, maybe more processes, even down to 3 levels. You've got lots and lots of them. You're not going to manage them all at once. You shouldn't try. Don't even try and do 10 or 20 or 30. Just pick 5, 3 if you like, and learn how to do it, how it works, demonstrate how it works. You've got 3 process owners who've done a good job. Okay, when you pick another 5 for the next round, those 3 can instruct the others. You know, you've got some good mentoring that can happen now. So we do it incrementally, and we'll get there much faster, and it'll work. What else we got? How we run out of time? You're the time clock man. Yeah.
Yes. So Roger will pick up the last 3 questions. This question is about the value of PPM, and this has been discussed many times about, has been asked, how do we translate the benefits of PPM or conducting process assessment into value of money before initiating any improvement project? Or how do we assess the success of a BPM?
Well, this is the classic case. I mean, if the circles were turning, then the PI circle got triggered because, let's say, we found that there was we got a signal from our process behavior chart that said that there is some exceptional change in the behavior of the process. So we need to do something about it because it's now working beyond the limits. So that, you know, and we know something about that before we get to the PI circle. We're not just wandering into a room, picking a process and say, let's have a go at this. You know, we're a PI process improvement project is the project, and it's got a project brief, and it got triggered for some good reason, presumably by the process owner. So then we need to go through whatever the method is for process analysis and improvement. You know, we need to understand what the problem is, what the impact is. You know, I think that's a big issue. We don't often do that well enough. You know, okay, there's a problem. We can define the problem. It takes too long. Okay, but so what? You know, who does that concern? Does it cost a lot of money? Do we lose customers? Do we, you know, what's the problem? What's the impact of the problem? Which is to say, should we fix it? And if we can get a really good business case then to say, okay, well, yeah, it's a real problem and it's urgent and we should fix it, and the cost of not fixing it is this, cost of fixing it is this. Okay, yes, there's a solid business case. Here's the 1 or 2 projects we need to make that happen. Then off it goes, and the PO circle is still turning, right? So we've still got we've still got people monitoring the performance of the process. So that's why the circles are turning all the time, the PO circle anyway. We want to see the impact. We want to see, we made a change, and we want to see an exceptional event on the process behavior chart because we meant there to be one. We want something non-routine to happen as a result of the change we made. That was why we made the change. So we're tracking that all of the time. So, you know, it's not just a matter of picking a process and saying, let's run this through some as is to be analysis and see what happens. They're the sort of process improvement projects where you get a bunch of recommendations that seldom get implemented because nobody cares. You know, it's a nice thought. You know, yes, we could improve the process, but it's not a problem anyone cares to fix. So why would they? So I think if we've got the circles turning, You know, the only reason we'd run a project is because we wanted to improve a process.
Correct.
Something to think about. Okay, what else we got?
Perfect. Roger, control chart that you have shared as a process behavior chart. What do you recommend? Should it be used in PO circle or in PI circle or in both? Where does its fitment?
I think it should be used all the time.
Yeah.
So it's used, you know, it's one of the main tools of the process owner and everybody else who's interested in the performance of the process. Do we have a predictable process? Is the predictable level of performance acceptable? If it is, that's good. If the predictable level of performance is not acceptable, then we need to do something about that. If we've got exceptional events happening, we're getting signals in the noise, then we need to go and find the root cause of those events. So I think a lot of it is happening. Well, it's happening before, during, and after the MAIC or any other methodology. And you have a similar question comes up sometimes when people try and relate PDCA, PDSA, whatever form you want to take that, to the circles. And it's kind of not the same. It splits PDCA across the circles in, I think, a useful way. But yeah, I think we should be continuously managing our processes, not just doing from time to time a process improvement project. So we need continuous management and continuous improvement. That's why there are two circles.
True. All right. Rather, last question of the day is about, can you share some best practices about the process of process management?
I thought I just did. Oh, you mean I see, in companies, who does it well?
Yeah, who are the other companies? Yeah.
Yeah, who are the companies that do it well?
But naming a company probably would not be useful.
Right. I've got some clients listening here. I better not name names. But to be fair, I don't think there are many companies in the world who are doing it across the company extraordinarily well. If I had to pick one, and I can tell you about this because there was a presentation at a conference last year, somewhere that I know well. It's an organisation called Zespri in New Zealand, and they're the people that grow and ship kiwi fruit to some 50 or 60 countries around the world. And they do it extraordinarily well. And Matt Mueller from Zespri gave a presentation at the London BPM conference last year, looking back over, I think it was 5 or maybe it was 10 years of history. So it was extraordinarily good. And there are lots of people that are doing it well. Some organisations in Saudi Arabia where I've done a lot of work do it well. And there are lots of organisations who will do it well, but they just don't talk about it because they consider it to be strategically important. The Commonwealth Banking Group in Australia has a good track record of doing good process work. People in Saudi Arabia, like the Ministry of Comms and IT, like CITC, the Intellectual Property Office. God, I apologise to those that I've just left out. They're people that are doing it. They're some of them on the early stages, but they can see the benefits. Lots of executive support, and it's going well. So I think it works well in lots of organisations, but you've got to keep it going. There's a slump you can get into after you've built the process architecture and got it all going. Everyone's kind of, thank goodness that's over, and we all stop. Well, that's when we start, not when we stop. And that's what my intent today was, to just show you a few artifacts and a kind of process that will keep us going and show the benefits, because the real way to keep it going is to deliver benefits, and benefits are improvements in organisational performance in ways that managers, functional managers, appreciate. The people that will say whether this is working or not are those managerial and executive decision makers in the organisation. If they find it useful, then it's useful. If they don't find it useful, it won't continue. Why should it?
All right, Roger, we can take the last question. I got one more. Interesting one. If we believe that we have produced a good process model, but it's not delivering because of lack of acceptance or compliance by personnel, is that a problem with that process or with the project management process?
Okay, we need to unpack that a little. So the first point though, I mean, a good process model doesn't mean the process is going to work. The process model is not the process. If the process is working, then I want to see the data. Or if it's not working, what does that mean? So show me the PBC, the process behavior chart. Let's talk about the problems. You know, if you say this doesn't work well, we've got to quantify that. Which KPIs are failing, etc. Now, if it's not working and people won't turn up to the meeting because they don't care, then you know that's not a problem with that process anyway. Maybe we need to go back to recruit staff. But it also might be that, you know, sometimes in our organisations we introduce people to the whole process world by dragging them along to process modelling workshops. And we put them through this tedious stuff hour after hour after hour, and we produce a process model that they've got no use for. Maybe someone in IT is going to use it for a while, but you know, it's not, they don't understand because they haven't seen the circles. They don't understand that we're going to do cross-functional process management, and we've got to understand what the processes are. So I think it's the lack of buy-in for cross-functional process management is in the main a lack of understanding. You seldom meet an executive or a manager for that matter, or certainly anyone down there trying to make processes work. You seldom meet them who think about this in this cross-functional way and say, yeah, no, that's not right. I mean, it is right, it's a fact. So if we can get that message across, then people buy into it. And again, I keep coming back to the fact we don't want to start out with 30 processes, start out with 3, 4, 5. One, if you have to, prove that it works, and then build that internal marketing campaign around the fact that here's how it works. And you know, the benefit is not we've created 500 process models. The benefit is that we've reduced customer complaints, we've increased profitability, we've reduced the time it takes to do something, etc. You know, actual valued business benefit. There's a much longer answer. I wrote a book about it.
All right. Perfect. Thank you so much, Roger, for your time, for your insight about the business process management. Thank you everyone for your participation, your discussions, questions. We are always here in case if you have any question you would like to discuss with us. We will be more than happy to discuss with you, to provide you the required information. And yes, let us know if there is any topic, anything that you would like to discuss, you would like to have a webinar on the topic. We will be more than happy to organize it. Thank you very much once again to all of you, and you will get an email with the recording of this webinar so that you can refer it, access it anytime that you want. Thank you so much. Thank you, Roger, once again. Wish you a great day and have a nice day, nice evening to everyone. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Bye all.